Rebecca Sloan thought she was humiliating just another tired traveler at gate 14 that snowy night. But within the next 30 minutes, the entire airport would realize she had just denied boarding to the woman who practically owned the airline itself. The executive terminal at O'Hare International Airport glowed beneath rows of warm recessed lights, while heavy snow slammed against the towering glass windows overlooking the runway. Outside, de-icing trucks crawled through the storm like giant mechanical insects, their amber lights flashing through the darkness as exhausted travelers crowded the premium boarding area, hoping their flights wouldn't be canceled before Christmas weekend. Inside the first-class gate lounge, polished marble floors reflected designer luggage, tailored coats, and steaming paper cups of overpriced coffee, while quiet conversations blended with the distant echo of overhead announcements. Rebecca Sloan stood near the boarding scanner with the rigid posture of someone who enjoyed authority a little too much. At 36, she had built her reputation around maintaining what she called premium standards. Her navy airline blazer was perfectly pressed, her blonde hair twisted into a severe bun, and her expression carried the practiced sharpness of a woman who judged people within seconds of seeing them. Most passengers avoided eye contact with her entirely. Then Naomi Bennett stepped into line. She wore a soft gray sweater beneath a long wool coat that looked years old, simple white sneakers dampened by melted snow, and carried a faded leather laptop bag over one shoulder. No jewelry beyond a silver watch. No designer logos. No entourage. At 41, Naomi moved with calm efficiency, quietly checking her phone while the wealthy passengers ahead of her flashed platinum status cards and complained about weather delays. To most people in line, she looked like a tired consultant or maybe a middle-class professor trying to survive holiday travel. Rebecca noticed her immediately. Her eyes traveled slowly over Naomi's outfit before narrowing slightly. The judgment came fast and automatic. She doesn't belong here. Nearby, a man in an expensive charcoal overcoat glanced toward Naomi and smirked at his wife. Looks like somebody wandered into the wrong boarding lane. He whispered softly enough to avoid confrontation, but loud enough to be heard. His wife chuckled behind her coffee cup. Naomi heard them. She simply remained quiet. That calmness irritated Rebecca even more. People who were embarrassed usually apologized or stepped aside. Naomi did neither. She waited patiently as the first-class line moved forward inch by inch beneath the glow of the gate monitor reading Flight 226, New York JFK. Rebecca scanned another boarding pass with robotic efficiency before finally looking up at Naomi. "Boarding pass," she said flatly. Naomi handed over her phone. Rebecca scanned it once. The machine beeped red. A small wrinkle formed between Rebecca's eyebrows. She scanned it again. Another red flash. Several passengers turned to watch. Naomi remained composed. "Problem?" she asked politely. Rebecca didn't answer immediately. Instead, she tilted the screen slightly away as if shielding confidential information. "Step to the side, ma'am." Naomi blinked once. "Is there an issue with the ticket?" Rebecca finally looked directly at her. "This is an executive priority boarding credential." Her tone sharpened slightly on the last words. "Yes," Naomi replied calmly. "That's correct." Rebecca's lips pressed together. The man in the charcoal coat gave a soft laugh behind them. "This should be interesting," he muttered. Snow hammered harder against the windows while tension slowly spread through the gate area. A young mother seated nearby lowered her phone, sensing something uncomfortable unfolding. Naomi stood quietly while Rebecca typed aggressively into the terminal keyboard. The silence stretched long enough to draw attention from nearly everyone nearby. Then Rebecca finally exhaled through her nose and folded her arms. "Ma'am," she said, loud enough now for half the gate to hear. "Premium executive boarding isn't available to unauthorized passengers." A hush settled over the line. Naomi's eyes stayed steady. "I was issued that credential directly by the airline." Rebecca gave a short smile that contained no warmth whatsoever. "I'm sure you believe that." Several passengers exchanged awkward glances. One businessman shook his head slightly as though embarrassed on Naomi's behalf. But Rebecca wasn't finished yet. In fact, she was only getting started. Rebecca Sloan had spent years mastering the art of making people feel small in under 10 seconds, and standing beneath the bright gate lights that night, she believed Naomi Bennett would be no different. The boarding line slowed almost immediately as passengers sensed the tension unfolding near the scanner. A teenage boy removed one earbud. An older couple stopped midway toward the jet bridge. Even the nearby gate agent, pretending to organize paperwork, kept glancing nervously toward Rebecca and Naomi. The storm outside intensified, thick snow swirling against the giant windows, while overhead announcements echoed through the terminal about delayed departures and canceled regional flights. Yet inside Gate 14, all attention centered on the woman in the gray sweater standing quietly beside the boarding lane. Rebecca tilted the scanner toward herself again and frowned dramatically. "Interesting," she said, drawing out the word just enough to embarrass Naomi publicly. "This boarding authorization appears to be tied to executive clearance." Naomi nodded once. "Yes." Rebecca gave a short laugh under her breath. "Executive clearance is reserved for corporate leadership, board members, and invited partners." Naomi remained calm. "I understand." The businessman in the charcoal coat folded his arms smugly. "Maybe she bought the ticket online from one of those scam sites," he suggested loudly enough for nearby travelers to hear. A few people chuckled awkwardly. Naomi did not react. That composure unsettled Rebecca more than anger would have. Most passengers became defensive under pressure. Some raised their voices. Others begged. Naomi simply stood there with the same measured calmness, her steady blue eyes never leaving Rebecca's face. Rebecca leaned slightly closer. "Can I see a second form of identification?" Naomi handed over her driver's license without argument. Rebecca glanced at it quickly before pausing. Her eyes narrowed at the name, Naomi Bennett. Something about it seemed familiar, but Rebecca could not place it. Instead of admitting uncertainty, she doubled down. "And your corporate affiliation?" Naomi slid a slim black card from her coat pocket and handed it over. Rebecca looked at the minimalist silver lettering. Bennett Aeronautics Group. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. The company was massive. Nearly every major airline in the country used its aviation software systems. Rebecca recognized the name instantly from internal corporate memos and executive conferences streamed for management employees. But instead of reconsidering the situation, she assumed the card had to be fake or borrowed. Her expression hardened again. "Anyone can print a business card," she said coldly. Naomi slowly slipped the card back into her pocket. "Would you like me to contact someone from corporate?" Rebecca folded her arms tighter. "What I would like is for passengers without proper authorization to stop delaying boarding." The sentence landed like a slap. Several nearby travelers shifted uncomfortably. The young mother sitting nearby frowned openly now while her little daughter whispered, "Mom, why are they being mean to that lady?" The mother quietly shushed her, embarrassed by the honesty only children could deliver so naturally. Naomi inhaled slowly, then glanced briefly toward the runway where snowplows moved through the storm beneath flashing orange lights. For just a moment, something tired passed through her eyes. She had spent years inside boardrooms filled with men who underestimated her until she spoke. Years listening to executives mistake simplicity for weakness. Yet somehow, the public humiliations always felt sharper when they happened in ordinary places like this. Rebecca tapped the scanner impatiently. "If you cannot verify your executive status immediately, I am going to need you to step away from the premium boarding lane." Naomi looked back at her. "I have a confirmed seat assignment." "That is not the issue anymore," Rebecca replied. The gate area grew quieter. A pilot walking through the terminal slowed slightly as he noticed the gathering crowd near the boarding entrance. To flight. Attendants exchanged uncertain glances near the counter. Naomi noticed them, but said nothing. Rebecca sensed the attention and unconsciously straightened her blazer. Public authority energized her. "People work very hard for premium access," she continued loudly. "We cannot simply allow anyone to walk into executive boarding because they claim they belong there." Naomi's expression never changed, but the room itself seemed to tighten around those words. The businessman in the charcoal coat smirked openly now. "Exactly," he muttered. Standards matter. Rebecca nodded subtly toward him, enjoying the support. Then she turned back toward Naomi and delivered the sentence that pushed the humiliation past the point of simple inconvenience. At this time, she announced clearly enough for the entire gate to hear, I am formally denying your boarding privileges pending verification. Silence swept across the lounge. Even the constant airport noise seemed to fade for half a second. Naomi stood completely still beneath the cold white gate lights while dozens of strangers stared at her. And somewhere deeper inside the terminal, a phone had already started ringing. The moment Rebecca Sloan denied Naomi Bennett boarding in front of an entire premium lounge, she believed the situation was finished, controlled, resolved neatly beneath airport policy and polished authority. But humiliation has a strange way of exposing the true character of everyone in the room. Naomi stood quietly beside the boarding scanner while the line behind her remained frozen in uncomfortable silence. Snow continued crashing against the airport windows in thick white waves, and somewhere overhead, another delayed departure announcement echoed through the terminal speakers. Yet nobody at Gate 14 seemed focused on the storm anymore. Their attention remained locked on the woman in the gray sweater being treated like an intruder in a place she clearly had every right to stand. Rebecca adjusted her blazer with visible satisfaction, mistaking Naomi's silence for defeat. You can either step aside voluntarily, she said crisply, or airport security can assist you. A low murmur spread through the crowd. The businessman in the charcoal coat shook his head with smug approval while his wife whispered something about people trying to scam premium boarding during the holidays. Naomi glanced briefly toward the jet bridge entrance where first-class passengers were still boarding slowly. She checked the time on her silver watch. 8:47 p.m. In less than 12 hours, she was supposed to present a restructuring proposal in Manhattan that could determine the future of 3 regional airlines and nearly 12,000 employees. Yet despite the pressure weighing on her shoulders, her voice remained remarkably calm. I am not refusing to cooperate, she said softly. Then cooperate by leaving the line, Rebecca replied immediately. The sharpness in her tone made several passengers visibly uncomfortable now. A younger gate agent named Melissa shifted nervously behind the counter. She had only worked for the airline for 8 months, but even she sensed something felt wrong about the situation. Naomi did not behave like someone lying. She did not panic. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood with a quiet dignity that seemed increasingly out of place against Rebecca's growing hostility. Melissa leaned toward Rebecca carefully. Maybe we should call corporate verification, she whispered. Rebecca barely looked at her. I already know what this is, she muttered back. People try this all the time. Naomi heard every word. Still, she remained composed. That composure only deepened Rebecca's irritation. She wanted embarrassment. She wanted apology. Instead, Naomi gave her patience, and patience can feel almost insulting to people who crave control. Nearby, the little girl seated beside her mother continued staring openly at Naomi. She does not look dangerous, the child whispered innocently. Her mother looked mortified. Emma, quiet. But several people nearby had heard it, and the sentence landed harder than the child realized. Rebecca suddenly grabbed the phone beside the scanner and pressed a button aggressively. Security assistance requested at Gate 14, she announced. The words instantly changed the atmosphere. Some passengers stepped farther away from Naomi as though embarrassment itself were contagious. Others pulled out phones discreetly, sensing drama worth recording. Naomi lowered her eyes for a brief moment, not from shame but exhaustion. This was not new to her. 10 years earlier, investors had mistaken her for an assistant during her own company presentation. 5 years earlier, a hotel manager had asked if she could afford the presidential suite she had already purchased. Wealth had never protected her from judgment because Naomi had never dressed like power. She had learned long ago that people only respected status when it looked expensive enough. Rebecca crossed her arms triumphantly after making the call. Now we wait, she said. Naomi finally looked directly at her. You could resolve this in less than 60 seconds with one phone call. Rebecca smiled coldly. People with legitimate executive clearance do not need to beg for validation. The sentence settled across the gate like ice. Melissa quietly looked down at her desk, clearly ashamed now. Then something shifted. One of the flight attendants standing near the boarding door suddenly stared harder at Naomi. His expression changed almost instantly. Confusion first, then recognition. The color slowly drained from his face. He stepped backward toward another crew member and whispered urgently into her ear. Both of them turned toward Naomi again. Rebecca noticed the movement immediately. "What is it?" she snapped. Neither attendant answered right away. Across the terminal, an internal phone began ringing loudly inside the operations office. Then another. A moment later, the gate computer flashed with an incoming priority notification. Melissa looked down at the screen and froze completely. Her eyes widened as she slowly lifted her head toward Naomi Bennett. And for the first time that night, somebody at Gate 14 looked genuinely afraid. The moment Melissa saw the name attached to the priority notification on her screen, her stomach dropped so fast she nearly forgot how to breathe. The glowing terminal monitor reflected in her widened eyes while the noise of the airport seemed to fade into a distant blur. Snow continued hammering the runway. Outside, but inside Gate 14, the atmosphere had shifted completely. Melissa stared at Naomi Bennett, then back at the screen again as if hoping she had misread it. But the message remained there in bold red letters. Executive Priority Alert. Hold departure. A second line appeared beneath it almost immediately. Board Chairman en route to Gate 14. Rebecca noticed Melissa's frozen expression and frowned impatiently. "What now?" she demanded. Melissa swallowed hard. "I think maybe we should pause boarding." Rebecca let out a sharp laugh. "We are already paused because of her." She motioned dismissively toward Naomi without even looking at her. Naomi remained calm beneath the harsh white lighting of the gate area, her weathered laptop bag still hanging quietly from her shoulder, while dozens of passengers watched the scene unfold in growing confusion. The businessman in the charcoal coat no longer looked amused. Now he looked uncertain. One of the flight attendants stepped cautiously toward Rebecca. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I think there may be some misunderstanding here." Rebecca turned sharply toward him. "There is no misunderstanding. This passenger cannot verify executive clearance." The attendant hesitated. "Actually, I recognize her." Silence. Rebecca blinked once. "Excuse me?" The attendant looked toward Naomi respectfully now. "I saw her at the aviation summit in Seattle last spring." Rebecca crossed her arms tighter. And that was not exactly a small event. A nervous hush spread across the gate lounge. Naomi said nothing. That silence was becoming heavier by the minute. Melissa's hands trembled slightly as another incoming call flashed across the operations screen. She answered immediately. "Gate 14, she said carefully. The voice on the other end spoke so loudly that even Rebecca could hear fragments of it. "Do not let that aircraft leave." Melissa's face turned pale. "Yes, sir." Rebecca stepped closer. "What is going on?" Melissa lowered the receiver slowly. "Corporate operations is asking for a delay authorization." Rebecca scoffed immediately. "For weather?" "No," Melissa hesitated. "For Ms. Bennett." The room went completely still. Even the nearby passengers holding coffee cups seemed frozen mid-motion. Rebecca stared at Naomi for a long second before forcing out a dry laugh. "This is ridiculous." But uncertainty had finally entered her voice. Naomi glanced briefly toward the runway lights blinking through the storm. "You still have time to handle this professionally," she said quietly. Rebecca's pride would not allow retreat anymore. Too many people were watching. Too many passengers had already witnessed her authority. Backing down now would feel like humiliation, and people obsessed with status often fear embarrassment more than being wrong. "No," Rebecca replied sharply. "What I have is a passenger refusing standard verification procedures." Then the elevator doors at the far end of the premium terminal opened. 3 men in dark overcoats stepped out, moving quickly across the marble floor. One carried a tablet. Another wore the silver operations badge reserved for senior airline executives. But it was the third man who changed everything. Julian Cross. Even passengers who did not recognize his face knew immediately he was important. He moved with the calm gravity of someone accustomed to rooms falling silent when he entered them. At 62, the chairman of Atlantic Skies Airlines carried himself with understated authority. His silver hair neatly combed, his navy overcoat dusted lightly with snow from outside. Rebecca's confidence shattered the second she recognized him. "Mr. Cross," she whispered. Julian barely looked at her. His eyes locked directly onto Naomi Bennett. Then, in front of the entire gate lounge, the chairman of the airline walked straight past Rebecca Sloan as though she barely existed. The polished marble floor echoed beneath his shoes while every employee nearby stiffened instantly. Naomi finally looked up at him fully for the first time that evening. Julian gave a respectful nod. "Ms. Bennett," he said calmly, "the board has been trying to reach you for the last 20 minutes. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke." Rebecca's face lost all color. The businessman in the charcoal coat slowly lowered his phone. Melissa stared openly now, realization washing across her face. But Julian Cross was not finished. He turned slowly toward Rebecca, his expression unreadable. "Would someone," he said carefully, "care to explain why the future majority owner of this airline is standing outside the boarding gate?" The entire room went silent. The silence inside Gate 14 after Julian Cross revealed Naomi Bennett's identity did not feel ordinary. It felt heavy, electric, almost fragile, as though the entire terminal suddenly understood that one wrong word could shatter what little dignity remained in the room. Rebecca Sloan stood motionless beside the boarding scanner. Her face drained completely of color, while the glowing gate monitor reflected faintly in her wide blue eyes. Only minutes earlier, she had spoken to Naomi with cold superiority in front of dozens of travelers. Now the chairman of the airline himself stood beside the same woman with visible respect. The contrast was devastating. Nobody in the lounge seemed willing to breathe too loudly. The businessman in the charcoal overcoat slowly slipped his phone back into his pocket, suddenly unwilling to keep recording. His wife stared down at her coffee cup, avoiding eye contact with anyone nearby. Even the little girl seated beside her mother had gone quiet now, sensing the emotional shift without fully understanding it. Julian Cross removed his gloves calmly while snow swirled behind the giant terminal windows. "Ms. Bennett was scheduled to meet the board in Manhattan tonight," he continued evenly. "The acquisition documents are being finalized at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning." Rebecca blinked rapidly. "Acquisition?" she whispered. Melissa answered before she could stop herself. "Bennett Aeronautics Group." Her voice trembled slightly. "They are buying controlling interest in Atlantic Skies." A ripple moved through the crowd like a wave passing across water. Several passengers exchanged stunned looks immediately. The name Bennett Aeronautics carried enormous weight in the aviation industry. Naomi's company powered scheduling systems, flight optimization software, fuel efficiency algorithms, and emergency communication networks used across the country. Industry magazines called her one of the most influential executives in modern aviation, though most people would never recognize her in public because Naomi avoided interviews, luxury branding, and celebrity culture entirely. Rebecca's lips parted slightly as the realization finally reached her in full. She looked back toward Naomi's simple sweater, worn sneakers, and faded leather bag as though trying desperately to reconcile them with the image of corporate power she had built in her mind her entire life. Naomi noticed the confusion immediately. She had seen that look before. People always expected power to arrive wrapped in designer labels and arrogance. Quiet confidence confused them. Julian glanced briefly toward the frozen boarding line. "May I ask," he said carefully, "why Ms. Bennett was denied boarding tonight?" Rebecca opened her mouth, but no sound came out at first. Her throat tightened visibly beneath the pressure of dozens of eyes staring at her now instead of Naomi. Melissa lowered her gaze. One of the flight attendants shifted uncomfortably near the jet bridge entrance. Finally, Rebecca forced out a weak explanation. There were concerns about verification. Julian's expression did not change. "Verification?" Rebecca nodded quickly. "Her executive credentials triggered irregularly and I believed." Her voice faded. because the truth sounded uglier out loud than it had inside her own head. Julian looked toward Naomi quietly. Did anyone contact corporate verification? Naomi answered before Rebecca could. No, another silence. Smaller this time, but sharper. The chairman inhaled slowly through his nose while Rebecca's confidence collapsed piece by piece beneath the weight of the moment. Naomi could see it happening. The woman who had spoken with such authority 20 minutes earlier now looked frightened. Not because of corporate consequences yet, but because public humiliation had reversed direction completely. The room that once judged Naomi was now judging Rebecca. And Naomi understood something important in that instant. Shame feels very different when you are the one standing alone beneath everyone's eyes. Julian turned toward Rebecca again. Do you understand how serious this situation is? Rebecca's eyes glistened slightly now. Yes, sir. Do you? His voice remained calm, which somehow made it worse. Rebecca swallowed hard. I was trying to protect premium boarding policy. Naomi finally spoke again. Her tone soft but clear enough for everyone nearby to hear. Policies matter, she said. Rebecca looked at her hopefully for half a second, as though searching for mercy. Then Naomi continued. But so does how you treat people while enforcing them. The sentence landed harder than anger ever could have. Several passengers lowered their eyes immediately. Even the businessman in the charcoal coat looked ashamed now. Naomi stepped slightly closer to Rebecca, though her expression remained calm. You assumed I could not belong here before you asked a single question. Rebecca's composure cracked completely. Ms. Bennett, I am so sorry. Naomi studied her quietly for a long moment. Not with hatred, not with revenge, just disappointment. How many people, Naomi asked gently, have walked away from this gate feeling humiliated because they did not look wealthy enough for your standards? Nobody spoke. The snowstorm outside continued raging across the runway while inside the premium terminal. The only sound remaining was the distant hum of airport lights above a room full of strangers forced to confront what dignity really looks like. Rebecca Sloan felt every eye in Gate 14 pressing against her now, the same way Naomi Bennett had endured those stares only minutes earlier, and for the first time in years, authority no longer felt powerful, felt painfully fragile. The premium lounge remained frozen in silence while snow battered the windows overlooking the runway. Outside, aircraft lights blinked through the storm like distant stars swallowed by white darkness. But inside the terminal, nobody seemed interested in flights anymore. The tension surrounding Naomi and Rebecca had become impossible to ignore. Julian Cross stood calmly beside Naomi, his posture relaxed, yet the quiet authority surrounding him filled the gate more completely than shouting ever could. Melissa remained behind the counter with her hands clasped tightly together, visibly shaken by how quickly the situation had escalated beyond anything she had imagined at the start of her shift. Rebecca tried to speak again. Ms. Bennett, I truly did not know who you were. Naomi looked at her steadily. That is exactly the problem. The sentence settled over the room with devastating clarity. Several passengers lowered their heads immediately. The businessman in the charcoal overcoat suddenly looked deeply uncomfortable standing where he was. Earlier, he had enjoyed the spectacle because he believed humiliation was happening to someone beneath him. Now he realized he had participated in it. Naomi adjusted the strap of her worn leather bag gently before continuing. Respect should never depend on whether someone is important enough to impress you. Rebecca's lips trembled slightly. I understand that now. Naomi's expression softened just enough to remove cruelty from the moment, but not disappointment. Do you? She asked quietly. Or do you only understand because you discovered I have power? Nobody moved. The little girl sitting beside her mother stared openly at Naomi with wide eyes while her mother looked close to tears herself. The child did not fully understand corporate ownership or airline acquisitions, but she understood kindness, and that was enough. Julian glanced briefly toward the frozen boarding line before turning back toward Naomi. The aircraft is prepared whenever you are, he said respectfully. Naomi nodded once, but she did not move yet. Instead, she looked around the lounge slowly, taking in the expensive coats, polished luggage, lowered eyes, an uncomfortable silence surrounding her. Then she spoke carefully enough for everyone nearby to hear. The aviation industry spends billions teaching employees how to treat premium customers, she said. Maybe it is time we spent more teaching people how to treat human beings. The words hit harder than any public outburst could have. Melissa felt heat rise behind her eyes. Even the flight attendants standing near the jet bridge looked ashamed now. Rebecca's carefully constructed image of control had completely collapsed beneath the weight of Naomi's quiet dignity. Yet Naomi still refused to humiliate her back. That restraint made the lesson impossible to ignore. Rebecca swallowed hard. I never meant to hurt anyone. Naomi gave a faint, sad smile. Most people do not. Another silence followed. This one quieter, heavier. Somewhere in the distance, luggage carts rattled across the terminal floor, while another delayed flight announcement echoed faintly through the airport speakers. Life around them continued normally, yet Gate 14 felt suspended in time. Then something unexpected happened. The businessman in the charcoal overcoat stepped forward awkwardly. His arrogance from earlier had vanished entirely. Ma'am, he said toward Naomi. I owe you an apology too. Naomi looked at him calmly. For what? He hesitated. For assuming things about you. Naomi nodded slightly. Thank you for saying that. His wife quietly wiped her eyes while looking away. One by one, the emotional atmosphere inside the lounge began shifting from embarrassment into reflection. People were no longer watching a public humiliation. They were confronting themselves. Julian checked his watch briefly before speaking again. The board meeting can wait another 10 minutes if necessary. Naomi smiled faintly for the first time that night. No, she said softly. I think everyone here has already waited long enough. Then she turned back toward Rebecca. The gate supervisor looked emotionally exhausted now, standing beneath the harsh white airport lights with none of the confidence she carried earlier. Naomi stepped slightly closer and lowered her voice just enough to remove the public edge from the moment. I am not going to ask for your job, she said. Rebecca looked stunned. You are not. Naomi shook her head slowly. Losing a position teaches fear. Learning empathy changes people. Rebecca's eyes filled completely now. She nodded silently, unable to speak. Naomi picked up her boarding pass from the counter where it had remained untouched during the entire confrontation. Then, with calm grace that seemed almost impossible after everything that had happened, she handed it back to Rebecca. Would you mind scanning it again? Rebecca's hand trembled as she took the phone. She scanned the pass once. The machine glowed bright green immediately. A soft boarding chime echoed through the silent gate lounge, and somehow, that simple sound felt louder than anything anyone had said all night. The soft green glow from the boarding scanner lingered across Rebecca Sloane's trembling hands like a final quiet verdict. And in that moment, everyone inside Gate 14 understood something that no corporate training manual could ever teach. Naomi Bennett had never needed power to embarrass anyone. Her dignity had done that all by itself. The boarding chime echoed faintly through the premium lounge, while snow continued sweeping across the dark runway outside. Nobody in line moved immediately after the scanner approved Naomi's boarding pass. It was as if the entire gate area needed a few extra seconds to process everything that had just happened. Rebecca slowly handed the phone back to Naomi with both hands now, almost instinctively respectful. Thank you, Ms. Bennett, she whispered softly. Naomi accepted the phone gently. You are welcome. There was no sarcasm in her voice. No triumph. No cruelty. That calmness somehow made the atmosphere even heavier. Julian Cross stepped slightly aside to allow Naomi access toward the jet bridge entrance. But before she moved, the little girl sitting beside her mother suddenly spoke again. Mom, she whispered loudly enough for several people nearby to hear. She looks like a normal person. A few nervous smiles appeared across the lounge. Naomi turned toward the child, her expression warming fully for the first time that evening. That is because I am, she said kindly. The child smiled back immediately while her mother looked embarrassed and emotional at once. Nearby, Melissa quietly wiped at the corner of one eye before pretending to organize paperwork again. The businessman in the charcoal coat stepped farther out of Naomi's path now, his arrogance completely gone. "Safe travels, ma'am," he said respectfully. Naomi nodded politely. "Thank you." Then she finally began walking toward the jet bridge. The polished marble floor echoed softly beneath her worn white sneakers while every eye in the terminal followed her movement. Just an hour earlier, those same shoes had caused people to dismiss her instantly. Now they seemed to symbolize something entirely different. Julian walked beside her for several steps before lowering his voice slightly. "The board is still furious about the leak from Denver operations," he said carefully. Naomi exhaled slowly. "We will handle Denver tomorrow. You handled tonight more gracefully than most executives would have." Naomi glanced briefly back toward the gate where Rebecca still stood frozen near the scanner. "Fear makes people cruel sometimes," she replied quietly, "especially when they confuse status with worth." Julian studied her for a moment before nodding thoughtfully. "That mindset is exactly why this company needs you." Naomi did not answer immediately. As they approached the aircraft entrance, one of the senior flight attendants straightened nervously. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Bennett." Naomi smiled faintly. "Thank you." But before stepping fully onto the aircraft, she paused. Slowly, she looked back one final time toward the premium lounge behind her. Rebecca remained standing near the gate counter, visibly overwhelmed by everything that had happened. Their eyes met briefly across the distance. Naomi gave her a small nod. Not a victorious nod. Not forgiveness exactly either. Something quieter. An acknowledgement. Rebecca lowered her gaze almost immediately, humbled in a way no punishment could have accomplished. Then Naomi stepped onto the plane. Inside the first-class cabin, conversations immediately softened as passengers recognized her from the gate incident. Some looked ashamed. Others looked curious. A few looked deeply thoughtful. Naomi moved calmly through the cabin, her faded leather bag resting lightly against her shoulder, while warm amber cabin lighting reflected across polished wood finishes and cream-colored seats. Julian gestured toward the private suite prepared near the front of the aircraft. "We upgraded the security protocols for tomorrow morning," he explained quietly. Naomi gave a tired smile. "Good, because after tonight, I think this company needs more than upgraded systems." The chairman chuckled softly beneath his breath. "You are already restructuring the culture before the acquisition is even finalized." Naomi slid into her seat near the window and looked out toward the snow-covered runway. "Technology can modernize an airline," she said quietly, "but character determines whether people feel respected while flying it." Back inside Gate 14, boarding slowly resumed beneath a silence very different from the one earlier that night. Passengers no longer whispered with judgment. Now they moved quietly, thoughtfully, carrying with them the uncomfortable realization that kindness should never require proof of importance first. Rebecca remained behind the scanner while Melissa carefully approached her. "Are you okay?" Rebecca stared down at the boarding monitor for a long moment before answering. "I think tonight I finally understood something." Melissa waited quietly. Rebecca swallowed hard. The people who deserve respect the most are usually the ones who never demand it. Snow continued falling outside as the aircraft door slowly closed, sealing shut one of the quietest and most unforgettable lessons everyone inside Gate 14 would carry long after that stormy Chicago night had ended. As the aircraft slowly pushed back from the gate beneath swirling Chicago snow, Naomi Bennett rested quietly beside the window while the storm lights reflected across the glass like distant flickers of memory, and somewhere behind her calm expression, she was already thinking about the people still standing back inside Gate 14. The first-class cabin remained unusually subdued. Most passengers who had witnessed the confrontation earlier avoided speaking above a whisper now. A few glanced toward Naomi occasionally before quickly looking away again, as though embarrassed by their own silence during the humiliation at the gate. The warm cabin lighting softened the polished wood interiors while flight attendants moved carefully through the aisle with an attentiveness that bordered on nervous respect. Naomi noticed it immediately. People always changed once they learned who she was. That had never been the part she enjoyed. Julian Cross sat across from her reviewing briefing documents on a tablet, but even he occasionally looked toward Naomi with thoughtful curiosity. Finally, after several quiet minutes, he lowered the device. "Can I ask you something honestly?" Naomi turned from the snowy runway lights outside. "Of course." Julian folded his hands calmly. "Why did you not expose yourself immediately back there?" Naomi smiled faintly. "Because I should not have needed to." The answer lingered between them. Julian nodded slowly. Most executives would have announced their title within the first 30 seconds. Naomi leaned back slightly in her seat. "That is because many people use power to protect themselves from disrespect." She looked down briefly at the silver watch on her wrist before continuing quietly. "I prefer discovering how someone treats people when they think nobody important is watching." Julian could not argue with that. The chairman had spent nearly 40 years inside corporate aviation, and he knew how often employees performed kindness only when status entered the room. Naomi glanced again toward the dark airport terminal slowly fading behind them. "Rebecca was not the real problem tonight," she said softly. Julian raised an eyebrow. "No." Naomi shook her head. "The real problem was how normal the situation felt to everyone watching." The sentence settled heavily across the quiet cabin. Several nearby passengers overheard it and lowered their eyes again. Naomi noticed but did not shame them for it. Shame alone rarely changed people. Reflection did. 30,000 feet above the Midwest an hour later, the storm finally faded beneath them, revealing a blanket of moonlit clouds stretching endlessly across the night sky. Most passengers had fallen asleep by then, but Naomi remained awake, reviewing financial reports spread neatly across the small tray table in front of her. Her company's acquisition of Atlantic Skies Airlines would become public within 48 hours. News networks would talk about technology, market value, and restructuring plans. Analysts would discuss stock movement and executive strategy. But none of them would know that Naomi's first real evaluation of the company had already happened inside a boarding gate in Chicago. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Ms. Bennett." Naomi looked up to see the senior flight attendant standing beside her seat holding a small handwritten note. "A passenger asked me to give this to you before landing." Naomi accepted the folded paper politely. The handwriting inside was shaky but sincere. It read, "Thank you for showing my daughter what real class looks like tonight." Naomi glanced toward the back of the cabin where the young mother and little girl sat sleeping quietly beneath airline blankets. For the first time all evening, genuine emotion softened Naomi's eyes. She folded the note carefully and slipped it into her bag beside contracts worth billions of dollars. Somehow, the handwritten message felt more important. When the aircraft finally descended toward New York just after midnight, Manhattan shimmered beneath the clouds like scattered gold across black velvet. The city looked endless, powerful, restless. Julian gathered his documents while the cabin lights slowly brightened. "The board meeting starts at 7 sharp, he reminded her. Naomi nodded. "I will be ready." Then she added quietly, "But before the meeting, I want every employee training protocol reviewed." Julian looked surprised. "After one incident?" Naomi turned toward him calmly. "One incident reveals a culture, especially when nobody notices it is wrong until power walks into the room." The chairman fell silent again. As the plane taxied toward the terminal, Naomi remained seated for a moment longer watching airport workers move through the freezing New York night below. Fuel trucks rolled slowly beneath floodlights. Baggage crews worked in thick winter jackets while exhausted travelers hurried across distant terminals carrying their lives in rolling suitcases. Most of them would never know her name. Most would never recognize her face. And Naomi preferred it that way, because the truest measure of a person was never how they treated someone important. It was how they treated the stranger who appeared to have no power at all. By 7 o'clock the next morning, the storm that had buried Chicago beneath snow had become nothing more than a fading headline. But for the people who stood inside Gate 14 the night before, the memory of Naomi Bennett walking quietly through public humiliation without ever losing her dignity would stay with them far longer than the weather ever could. Manhattan awakened beneath pale winter sunlight as black cars lined the entrance of Atlantic Skies headquarters in Midtown. News cameras waited across the street behind metal barriers while executives hurried through revolving glass doors carrying tablets, legal folders, and steaming coffee cups. Inside the 42nd floor boardroom, polished windows overlooked the city skyline while billion-dollar acquisition documents rested neatly across a walnut conference table. Naomi Bennett entered the room wearing the same gray sweater from the night before beneath a navy wool coat. No designer labels. No dramatic entrance. Yet every conversation inside the boardroom stopped immediately when she walked in. Some executives stood instinctively. Others simply watched her with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Overnight, many of them had already heard fragments of what happened in Chicago. Julian Cross closed the boardroom doors quietly behind her. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced calmly, "allow me to formally introduce the future Chief Executive Officer of Atlantic Skies Airlines." The room filled with applause, but Naomi raised a hand gently, stopping it almost as quickly as it began. "Thank you," she said softly. "But before we discuss profits, expansion, or restructuring, there is something more important we need to address." Silence settled instantly. Naomi placed her worn leather bag carefully on the conference table before looking slowly around the room. "Last night," she continued, "I was denied boarding by one of our employees because I did not look important enough to belong in a premium line." Several executives exchanged uncomfortable glances immediately. One board member cleared his throat nervously. Another lowered his eyes toward the table. Naomi noticed every reaction. "The problem is not that one employee made a mistake," she said. "The problem is that nobody around her thought the behavior was unusual until they discovered who I was." The room went completely still. Sunlight reflected softly across the tall glass windows while distant traffic hummed far below the skyscraper. Naomi's voice never rose, but every word carried weight far heavier than anger. "An airline is not defined by leather seats or loyalty programs," she continued. "It is defined by whether exhausted travelers, struggling parents, elderly passengers, and ordinary people feel respected while walking through our terminals." Julian watched quietly from the far side of the room, already realizing this speech would shape the culture of the company more than any financial strategy ever could. Naomi opened a folder slowly. Effective immediately, all executive training programs will be redesigned around customer dignity and employee empathy. One executive blinked in surprise. "Company-wide." Naomi nodded once. "Yes." Another board member leaned forward cautiously. "Based on one incident?" Naomi looked directly at him. "One incident reveals what people are comfortable tolerating." Nobody argued after that. Hours later, while financial news networks discussed the historic acquisition on television screens across the country, Rebecca Sloan sat alone inside a small employee conference room at O'Hare Airport staring at an email she had reread at least 10 times already. She had not been fired. Instead, Naomi Bennett had personally requested that Rebecca remain employed and participate in the airline's new leadership development program. At the bottom of the email, one sentence stood out more than everything else. "The goal is not punishment. The goal is understanding." Rebecca slowly lowered the paper into her lap. For the first time in years, she thought about the countless faces she had dismissed too quickly at boarding gates, customer counters, and premium lounges. Not because she was evil, but because somewhere along the way, she had mistaken